Good evening. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Thank you. I'm used to a bit of a gospel back and forth on that, a little church back and forth. I want to thank Lori and Dennis and Esther for bringing me here, and for the artists whose studios I visited today and will visit tomorrow. Thank you for opening your studios to me. I really appreciate it. Okay, so I'm sort of like one of my biggest secrets is I'm a nervous person. And so I like to know what's going to happen before it happens, which also means, like, whatever. That's not life. But I'm going to tell you what's going to happen before it happens. So I am going to read what I think is like some version of the opening chapter of something that looks like a book about why I've done what I've done, why I think it matters, and what art does. Like, what does it do? What does it do that has compelled me to dedicate like my entire adult life to it, right? So there's a preamble that's on the longer side. Then there's like this sort of like tough moment where I try and actually like say what I think it does or how it works. And then there's a little bit of like an example of like what it might all kind of add up to. And I'm nervous. All right, I didn't say that to like win your sympathy, but maybe a little. Okay, and here's the other thing. For the last 15 years, I've been very fortunate. I had major institutional posts, which meant I also had assistants. And so now I make my own PowerPoints, and they suck. I didn't know how to make one, apparently. And I still don't. All right, here we go. This is a story, okay? The drive from Houston to Lufkin pretty much takes place on one road, the old State Route 59, a north-south thoroughfare that can take you straight up to Dallas, though I've only ever done that longer drive twice. For the most part, I used to rent a car at the airport, pick up my grandmother, and drive us up to see her daughter, my aunt, Sister Mary John. Sister's given name was Helen Molesworth, the very same name bestowed upon me upon my birth. My entrance into the world occurred 4 years after she joined an order of Dominican nuns. An entry into religious life meant that she had to give up her first name and choose her second one. Sister spent her entire adult life as a cloistered nun at the Monastery of the Infant Jesus, located at 1501 Locust Lane, which is just off the loop road that encircles the small and formerly dry town of Lufkin, Texas. I've done this drive nearly my whole life. It started when I was a kid, and so my first memories of it are sitting in the back seat next to my grandmother. My grandmother always seemed ancient to me, partly because of the papery texture of the skin on her hands, which were covered with brown spots that mesmerized me, and partly because she had lots of funny turns of phrase that I would only understand later as being geographically specific. Mostly, however, her age registered for me because of the overwhelming particularity of the way she smelled. One of my favorite things to do when she came to New York to visit us from Texas was to be there when she opened her luggage. She traveled with the same large, hard suitcase covered with a bold blue and red geometrical pattern fabric for several decades. When the silver locks popped open, the smell would exit the bag like a palpable force. It clung to her dresses. She never wore what she referred to as slacks. It clung to her favorite denim skirt, her mysterious girdles and bras, and her timeless blue suede shoes, each item carefully wrapped in an old plastic bag from the dry cleaner. When we sat in the back seat, she would often pat my hand with her hand. Her narrowest of wrists was always adorned with a tiny watch, and on her ring finger of her right hand was a gold filigreed band set with one garnet, her birthstone. As a teenager, I sat more sullenly in the back seat while my grandmother rode up front with her baby sister, Teresa, who everyone called Teet. It was a matter of unspoken agreement that my grandmother should never drive. Teet died when I was in college, and as a result, I migrated to the driver's seat, and my grandmother rode shotgun, calling out place names, Cleveland, Livingston, Diboll, with the glee of a child who had just learned to read. The drive itself is a straight-shot, two-lane affair, the road pockmarked and bumpy, edged by bluebonnets in the spring and weeds the rest of the year. The 2 hours it takes to get from Houston to Lufkin is an exercise in being outside of the bubble. Juke joints compete with churches, folks sell what they can, firewood, catfish, bait, mobile homes and big cars sit rusted out in driveways with for sale signs on the windscreen. The drive gets magical at the very end, when, once you get off the highway, the country road, dotting with abidingly similar ranch houses, is covered by a lacy canopy of live oak. East Texas pines, the ones whose trunks stretch up way high, with their head of needles only appearing at the very top, intermittently dot people's front yards. By the time you get to the turnoff to the monastery on Lotus Lane, everything feels green, and the yellow of the sunlight is diffused and softened by the concentrated moisture in the air. Driving over a one-lane bridge, the monastery appears, its colonnaded arches constructed in post-war brick but formulated to look like Renaissance Italy. The second to last time I made this drive was to say goodbye to my aunt. She had called about a fortnight prior to say she was ill. An undiagnosed cancer had progressed rapidly. The talk was of months. It turned out to be weeks. My wife and I arrived, and as we opened the car door, the profusion of insects rubbing their wings together filled the thick air with a wall of sound. It was July, so the heat and humidity were stultifying, and my wife made the same joke she's been making for the 18 years we'd been coming here. "What's wrong with the air?" she said, just as I knew she would. We both laughed, the way couples do when they speak in code. We laughed the laughter that comes from knowing how such inside jokes bind us to each other in the gentlest of ways. We had decided to spend the night in Lufkin so that we could visit with Sister twice. And that evening, after my aunt had hired and needed to rest, after we took our supper in the monastery, prepared by the nun who had hospitality duty that visit, we drove the rental car to a local ice cream shop where, through my steady tears, I asked my wife what she thought the nuns meant when they said God. It turns out that at the veritable 11th hour, the previous 5 decades of my assiduous shying away from any conversation about religion seemed like a bad idea. It had clearly been a missed opportunity and was now a source of massive, grief-inspired confusion. Had the whole thing been a ruse? Had I not been honest? Was the fact that I didn't know what God meant to the sisters, many of whom I had known my whole life, my ultimate lie of omission? Even though my aunt was a cloistered nun, I had been raised by people who had definitively left the church. My parents had me baptized, probably because they thought they had to, and that was it, meaning that everything I knew about church or God or religion came via my grandmother, whose faith was unparalleled. My spouse, on the other hand, had been raised in a proper Catholic household with a mother who took her and her brother to Mass every Sunday. She knew what to do in church and had, as she did with many things, a singularly untroubled relationship to the entire event. When she turned the car into the dark parking lot, lit only by conical pools of humid light emanating from a few lampposts, and slowly angled the car towards the spot closest to the ice cream joint. She said, "Every time they say God, just replace it in your head with art." The algebraic clarity of the formulation temporarily halted my tears, not only because I felt quite loved by her at that moment, this person who knew that for me, art was God, but also because I knew she was right. In other words, I knew it would work. How I came to understand art to be something I could substitute for the word God is the subject of all that comes next in these pages. And the retrospective cast of mind, the memoiristic tone adopted by me now, started the summer my aunt died. Her passing in the summer of 2017 offered me the beginning of a frame. Susan's logic of substitution presented the path, and getting rather publicly fired from a big museum job a year later was the impetus to write down a few of the things I think I know and feel about art, what it is, what it's for, and what it does. This book is that project. My earliest memories of art are some of my fondest. I was a New York City kid, and my parents took me to museums regularly, which was compounded by my early public school education that involved field trips to museums of all kinds. My father, who grew up poor in Houston, had become an academic with wanderlust, and hence I had a childhood marbled with travel. By the time I was 13, my parents had packed our bags and flown off to live in London, Finland, and Paris. We spent at least 10 summers in Booth Bay Harbor, Maine, and then there was that memorable summer in Irvine, my first taste of California. And I regularly visited my grandmother and my family in Houston. All of this made me feel very different from the other kids in PS 219 in Flushing. It made me feel special. Travel set me apart from them. It was the thing that I did that they did not. The set of pink luggage given to me on my 6th birthday in preparation for our trip to London filled me with pride. No one else had luggage. No one had pink luggage. Whenever my father announced that we were all about to pick up and move and live somewhere else, all I remember feeling was a crazed sense of anticipation and excitement. Travel meant maps, a new bedroom, and adventure. Despite all of the museums we were taken to in foreign countries, my childhood self remained deeply chauvinist. I was a New Yorker, and I knew it. And as such, my earliest memories of art revolve around my hometown museum, which, having been raised in the capital of the 20th century, was the Metropolitan Museum of Art. My mother took me often as a girl, and I find my memories knitted and braided such that I am unable to pry them apart. I remember vignettes more than whole visits, just as I remember feelings more than words. The scenes are powerful, though, and as I recollect them, they seem prophetic, their tenacity acting as a kind of keystone in the edifice of my own sense of self. They are my foundation. I suppose everyone can summon an image of the grand staircase at the Met, flanked on either side by the enormous floral arrangements donated in perpetuity by Mrs. Very Old Rich White Person. I don't know her name, but she has my ever-loving gratitude. To this day, I can feel the epic scale, the rounded steps that lead up to the endless galleries of European painting. And yet, my first memory veers away from the monumental to the clandestine, and in it I find myself slinking through the narrow doorway just past the ticket counter towards the diminutive escalator to the left of the grand staircase. Some of you may even know it. This quick left-hand turn, with its pointed avoidance of the long hallway filled with Egyptian artifacts, still feels like a secret passageway, a shortcut, something out of a Nancy Drew novel. My memory is as slippery as it is concrete. I was probably no more than 7 years old when I saw a white man in an overcoat walking ahead of us. Head bowed, he was cursing out loud, his neck and arms contracting in spastic movement. Now, my father was an inveterate cursor, so I was well versed in this form of adult language. But I had also been instructed that most other people, kids and grown-ups alike, did not curse. Hence, cursing was only allowed at home. Cursing was a secret. I was entranced. And I remember a feeling that the adult version of me can now describe, purely in retrospect, as liberatory. The gag rule had been suspended. The child I was laughed out loud with the freedom of it. My mother, her whole body curving over me, protective and gentle, hushed me. He has a disease, she said, in a near whisper, that makes him unable to control himself. He doesn't want to say those things or make those noises or move his body like that. It's very sad, she said. It's Tourette's syndrome. As we glided onto the escalator after him, I felt like a chastened spy. I watched and listened to him intently. He continued to curse, though now I heard more of the guttural sounds. And watching his arms and neck twitch, I was filled with a mixture of fear, apprehension, sadness, and a curious feeling of calm. Everything felt different. Looking back on it now, I actually wonder if it was my first experience of sympathy. I remember thinking that it was good he was in the museum. I remember feeling that nothing bad could happen to him in our secret passageway. The museum was a place where people would understand. He could be alone there, alone with other people. Maybe outside he could get into trouble for saying bad words, for being weird. But here in the museum, he would be safe. Decades later, when I started working in museums, I often found myself hiding from my colleagues. The first, this is all true. The first hiding place was in the painting vault. Wait, that's not the right one. There it is. The first hiding place was in the painting vault at the Baltimore Museum of Art. It was my first big-time curatorial position. I'd come straight out of the academy and was offered the position of full curator. What I didn't know about museum work far outweighed what I knew about museum work. But because I had a PhD in art history, I had this really big story of art in my head. And because I was young and brash and impatient, read arrogant as fuck, I thought it was my job to reinstall the permanent collection galleries. I wanted to tell the new story of art. No more white boys club, no more pretty abstract pictures. Desperate to shake the dust off the place, I acquired works by Kara Walker and Lorna Simpson. I found the racism of Baltimore unbearable, and the class politics of the city were a rude awakening. The staff of the museum had been there for millennia, and many of them were still working for the former chief curator who had been summarily fired the year prior to my arrival. That's also true. The staff of the museum, it was a crash course in museum bureaucracy, office dynamics, and the general bullshit that comes with work. During this period, I had a fabulous hairdresser who once said to me, "That's why they call it work and not hooray." Words to live by that I offer you here this evening. After banging my head against one or another institutional limitation, I often went to the vault to look at the small Cézanne landscape, a ravishing Mount Saint Victoire. There I found myself cast back to my hidden escalator at the Met. Filled with my own curses and spasmodic energy, I came to an adult understanding of my childhood memory. The world is a cruel and awful place, filled with obstacles, almost all of them human, and museums were filled with people who were hiding from these horrors. Most of the folks I encountered in my new job were like stowaways, barricaded in offices filled with books and files and stacks of papers, dedicated to unfinished projects, leaving anthill traces of their labors. Some had long ago forgotten what it was about art that they loved, but many had not. Almost all of them were candle burners, keeping a flame going for a passion project of their own making, heads in the sand about the changes that were taking place in the world that were about to change museums radically. Who could blame them? I had just arrived. I was fresh, filled with energy and desire, convinced that the world was ready to hear new stories, ready to talk about art made by women, by people of color, by queers. I had subversive dreams. I gave public lectures about love in the galleries. I wanted to inspire. I didn't yet understand how strong the undertow of fear was. I didn't yet fully realize how many people were using the museum as a place to hide from the great cruelties of the world. I just knew that I was hiding in the vault, sucking all of the energy out of that Cézanne I could before I went back to my office to continue a battle I didn't even quite know I was waging. And when I was in the vault, I always thought about that man, a man who couldn't control himself, and my mother, who explained him to me with compassion. The truth is, I had been hiding in museums for years before I found myself in the paintings vault in Baltimore. By the time I reached high school, I was an inveterate truant. After I checked into homeroom, I would sneak out of one of the many open and unattended side doors and head uptown. More often than not, I could be found walking aimlessly, and probably high, through the Metropolitan, MoMA, or the Frick. I was not a diligent student by any stretch of the imagination. I did not teach myself the history of art. I was not some precocious autodidact. I was interested in a kind of sanctuary, sometimes from the world, sometimes just from the weather. I felt different at school. I was incipiently queer, unconventional looking, decidedly neither popular nor athletic, not a nerd, but not a cool kid either. I was smart, but man, did my classes bore me. I was a coaster, and I knew it. By the end of elementary school, I knew I could be smarter or better, but that would have meant conforming to the expectations of others, something I just wasn't able to do. But when I was in the museum, even when I didn't know what I was looking at or why I was looking at it, I felt good, by which I mean I felt smart and calm and safe. That I ended up working in museums surprised me for many years, but now looking back, it just seems like an inevitability. I hadn't planned for a museum career. In my day, and this is like circa late 1980s, the height of theory, the smart kids interested in art history became academics, and those who were deemed less smart worked in museums. I clearly didn't want to be in that camp. And I also came from a solidly lower middle class background, and everyone I knew at the time who worked in a museum came from a family with means. But what all of this meant is that I ended up with a kind of distance from museums, or more specifically, I had a distance from the idea of me in museums. This aloofness governed the first decade of my life as a curator. This detachment came largely from my ability to observe myself from a kind of floating position outside of myself, a phenomenon I remember acutely from childhood, in which I often imagined myself to be the subject of a film being watched by others. This skill, or perhaps I should just call it a capacity, to disengage both spatially and emotionally from myself in real time, to see myself in action while I was in action, came in handy. It helped me to cultivate a distance between myself and the institutions I worked for, and it meant I could have the feeling of being an outsider even as I was in the process of becoming an insider. One effect of this meant that I was always aware that there was a public that didn't get it. Because I wasn't entirely connected to the event at hand, I could see that art was hard for people. I was aware that the very museums that made me feel safe made others feel unwelcome. And because I had wandered in museums so aimlessly for so many years, I knew something of the fantasies that could possess a person doing just that. daydreams of solitude or finding true love, fantasies about how life once was or how maybe it could be, daydreams of being beautiful and wealthy, daydreams of being fiercely intelligent, of knowing what there was to be known, fantasies of time travel, of access, of touch, of sensuality, dreams of freedom and safety and acceptance. I knew you could walk through a museum and think about all that stuff and not think about art at all. I knew the pictures could roll by, all those naked white women, so many cows in a field, those ships on the ocean, and none of it could catch you. None of it would be interesting. I knew about the perplexity and boredom of all those stuffy rooms filled with their gold frames. And yet I returned to those spaces repeatedly, and they, along with the first three rows of a movie house, were my safe haven. I tell you this in the same register I tell folks I fell in love with my wife from across a room, by which I mean to say I loved her before I knew her, and for me the same was true with art. I loved it long before I understood it, and my path to understanding art was about as conventional as it gets. I got degrees in art history. I became friends with artists. I taught art history in college. I worked in a museum. In true Malcolm Gladwell fashion, I put in my 10,000 hours. I became an expert. But I find myself now wanting to reflect upon my expertise more than I want to enact it. What is it that art does that has engendered my affection, my time, my commitment? What forms of thought has my investment in art produced? When Susan suggested the simple replacement of God with art, why was that equation so clear? So I sheepishly listened to a podcast called On Being by Krista Tippett. I'm so embarrassed to say that out loud. Ugh, it's like me and my tea. I'm self-conscious about this because as a student of critical theory in the 80s and 90s, I am embarrassed by public discussions of things deemed spiritual. I say this even though a casually dispensed remark of bell hooks I heard in my early 20s haunts me to this day. And for those of you who don't know who bell hooks is, she's a super important scholar of African American literature, art, and history. One day in a seminar at the Whitney program, which is an experimental one-year program for artists, critics, and curators, Hook said something like, and I quote, "The left gave up a lot when it decided not to deal seriously with people of faith." That she said this during the height of the AIDS crisis in New York City was not lost on me then or now. That she said it shocked me at the time, and my response was to file it away, to mull it over, to know it was something I had to deal with, but that I wasn't able to deal with. Maybe now. I'm still not sure. But I do know that Krista Tippett's interest in things spiritual has led her to ask the same introductory question to everyone she interviews. What was the spiritual backdrop of your childhood? As a question, I find it really goes to the heart of the matter, for the answers invariably lay bare not only the speaker's specific religious beliefs or spiritual practices or lack thereof, but the answer typically evokes nothing less than the earliest coordinates of the person's capacity for thinking, for processing knowledge, and for forming beliefs. Turning the question on myself one afternoon, I realized the force of its revelation. For truly the spiritual backdrop of my childhood was embodied by my aunt and my grandmother. They were women of faith, and the Catholic Church carried each of them for their whole lives. And while I didn't believe in their God, omnipotent, white, male, paternal, I believed in their faith. Indeed, their capacity for belief, the gentleness with which they enacted their faith, and the sense of community, love, and fellowship that attended it stood in stark contrast to the marked loneliness that seemed to shape my parents' academic world. My grandmother babysat infants during Mass, and someone from church took her to the grocery store. She spoke of her parish priest as if he were the kindest and wisest man in the entire world. My aunt and her fellow sisters sang and played instruments, and they teased one another with mirth and pleasure. Their schoolgirlish laughter was a constant feature of every visit I made to the monastery. In other words, I believed in their faith. No, I'm sorry. In other words, I believed in the structure of their relation to the world, and I saw that their faith made things possible for them. Happiness, friendship, community, care, love, the things that the art world made possible for me. So the structure of faith is one of belief without benefit of proof. Hence its profoundly antagonistic relationship to the world made by the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. Despite the formation of art history as an academic discipline born of that Enlightenment scientific framework, I can find no proof when it comes to art. Nor can I find a structure of proof for other ideas that matter to me greatly, namely love and freedom. More on that later. Nevertheless, I believe art to be a form of intelligence. I believe art produces knowledge. I believe in its capacity for negotiating aporias. Now, aporia is one of those words, like there's no other word for the word aporia, so I have to use that word. So here's what the word aporia means. And aporia is when you have two competing ideas that contradict one another that exist simultaneously. You've all been there. That's an aporia. Two competing ideas simultaneously, and there's no getting around it. Kind of like Donald Trump is the president of the United States. For me personally, an aporia. All right, so I believe in art's capacity for negotiating aporias, for reveling in complexity, for rewarding patience and intelligence. And if, according to the etymological roots, philosophy, in its first instance, is a love of knowledge, then I feel pretty comfortable saying that I also find art to be as much a branch of philosophy as it is of aesthetics. And only in the West have humans separated philosophy and aesthetics. The other cultures hold these two things together, interwoven with one another. So whether the art at hand is producing or reporting on the knowledge of color or material process, or whether the art lays claim to having been produced through the act of research into a specific area of knowledge in order to translate that knowledge into art, I believe that art, and I suppose I should come clean here and say good art, or even great art, produces and enables knowledge. To claim art as knowledge is to harass our current popular assessment of art as entertainment. It's to lay a claim that art is not, as the New York Times would have it, part of a dyad called arts and leisure. Could we imagine how different the news would be if art was reported on as a necessity rather than a luxury, a provider of information rather than a diversion? Sure, art can be entertaining. And some things made as entertainment register in the world as art. David Simon's epic The Wire comes quickly to mind. But the good stuff, whether it's art or music or film or novels, is philosophy. Art is one of humanity's most profound forms of communication. And yet art does not announce itself as, and yet art does not announce itself as knowledge or philosophy. It announces itself as art. And in doing so, it claims certain forms of radical permission, the permission of direct address, the permission to be viewed under specific conditions, the permission to be set apart from the flow of daily life, the permission to be judged outside of any concern for need or efficiency, the permission to express oneself in a private language in a public space, the permission to invent, the permission to be oblique, the permission to be difficult, the permission to be beautiful, the permission to fail, and the permission to be vulnerable. Art affords all the permissions that daily life, governed by conventional rules of social engagement, does not. And perhaps paramount of all the permissions it offers is the permission of the artist to explore the very limits and reaches of her own consciousness without regard for what she might find there. Art is the space of open-ended inquiry into the terms and conditions of life. We tend not to be surprised when the terms and conditions of our lives change over time. But that art changes over time has remained the subject of much consternation. Each wave of the new, from Impressionism to performance art, has engendered outrage and hostility on the part of both art world cognoscenti and the general public. Sometime in the mid-19th century, as artists took increasing liberties with the permission afforded to them by their vocation, a rift developed between them and their audiences. Art became avant-garde, and as such it spoke to an increasingly smaller and more rarefied group of people. In the mid-20s, and by that I'm thinking like Courbet, like that's really for me the beginning when art just basically goes to the general public like we're out. You know, you want to come, but we're not coming to you anymore. In the mid-20th century, art became an object of market fascination that propelled it into the popular imagination in ways that are structured by confusion. What does it mean? And disbelief. It costs what? The effect of these two historical breaks, so 19th century development of the avant-garde with Courbet, mid-20th century, the sort of the beginning of the market, which I see as Pollock arriving in Life magazine. The effect of these two historical breaks between artists and their publics has resulted in a welter of confusion about what art is, who it's for, what it does, and why we need it. More recently, the arrival of the digital age has challenged the idea of the museum to its very core. In the age of instantaneous images, effortlessly stored in the ether, what are we to do with the hulking architecture, storage vaults, climate-controlled spaces, intense security protocols, and strict rules of engagement, don't touch, don't eat, that are the bedrock of museum reality? In a world of increasing transience and disposability, of dramatically truncated attention spans, and a generally jaded or even just benign relationship to history, is there still a value to deciding that some objects are better than other objects? So much better, in fact, that they need to be saved for future generations. Like the other major institutions of democracy, such as the library, the newspaper, and the university, the museum, an 18th century invention, finds itself limping into the 21st century, unsure of its values, neglectful of its core missions, and riven by its historical fault lines, created as it was in the crosshairs of colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and nationalism. It's in this sticky and difficult space between artists breaking with their publics and an increasingly fraught apprehension about what a museum is that I want to say what it is that I find so deeply necessary about both. This book is meant as an offering, written in a voice as close as I can get to something called an unadulterated truth, about why I think it's worth fighting for art and museums, even though on most days I admit it's a fight I think we might lose. And now, at this moment when my own life in museums is on hold, it seems really important to reflect on what it is it all might be for, and what kind of path we might have moving forward. Although the forward part of that is just not quite right, for I'm pretty sure there is no linear road ahead. Indeed, I think the way we move through time is circular and cyclical, a lesson I learned in part from Robert Smithson. In 1970, Smithson made the Spiral Jetty, a massive work of art situated in the Great Salt Lake of Utah. Using mud, salt crystals, rocks, and water from the lake and its surrounding shoreline, Smithson made a jetty that reached into the lake, not in that typical straight long line that we're all so familiar with, but in a spiral. Located far away from any urban center, the work is known mostly via photography. I myself have never been to it. And given the particularities of its environment, the work is sometimes hidden underwater and sometimes it emerges. It no longer looks as it did in its 1970s iteration, for now it is encrusted with salt crystals that have formed along its surface as a result of evaporation. Here is an artwork that exists permanently emerging and receding at the same time. It traffics equally in permanence and change. It troubles the idea of time as linear, and it is as skeptical about the idea that history fades into the background as it is distrustful about a perpetual present ever demanding our attention. At Spiral Jetty, time is a circular affair, folding over and in on itself. Here, time is something that moves backwards and forwards, up and down. It is a three-dimensional event that changes as we change. At Spiral Jetty, the past is not immutable. It moves. It alters itself. Spiral Jetty is a human-made thing, intimately involved with the ever-productive Earth, a place where human and geological time meet in a delicate embrace underneath a stark and shadowless sun. At Spiral Jetty, an ancient form of mark-making, nearly every civilization draws a spiral, meets a mark made possible by the bulldozers and heavy equipment that are the not yet extinct dinosaurs of the Industrial Revolution. And even that revolution has now been eclipsed by the digital age, which, like its predecessor, both enlivens and threatens our contemporary way of life, just as it unearths and buries parts of our collective past. Is the museum like Spiral Jetty, a marvelous feat made long ago by someone else, known to us mostly now through its representations, subject to forces that are profoundly altering our sense of what it once was? What was the museum when it was first imagined? What is it now? And how do the meanings and possibilities of what art is and what art does change because its central method of distribution, the museum, now finds itself underneath such enormous pressure? These questions feel crucial to me, and I don't propose to answer them with any kind of definitive academic authority. Rather, I find the only way I can pry open some of these nettlesome issues is through recourse to my own history with art, in which some of my own encounters are submerged, encrusted in salt, preserved in the amber of memory, while others are newly emerging and as such are responsive to our new environmental conditions. What's important about all of this is that the whole structure of art and museums, the way these objects and spaces portend to house our greatest ideals, our most expansive feelings and passions, this historical structure is in flux. In a digital age, in the age of Me Too and Black Lives Matter, our attempts at permanence, attempts largely perpetuated by the idea of art and museums, appear equally futile and necessary. It's an aporia. I want to tear the fuckers down, and I want to protect them with every fiber of my being. If the historical museum imagined linear progress and perpetual genius, then what do we do with a contemporary conception of meaning as contextual? Which implies that if meaning is contextual, the implication there is that meaning is always changing. For meaning is only possible, but, right, meaning is always changing because meaning is contextual. But meaning is also only possible because of the meanings made in the past. And we only experience those meanings of the past in a contested present. This is one of art's enormous strengths, to put us in this extraordinarily complex relationship to time. This is, for me, one of the key reasons art is a form of philosophy, because it helps us to understand ideas that are simultaneously of our moment and deeply historical. All right, so this is the This is the moment where I try and say it. If art is a form of philosophy, how does it produce knowledge? In my experience, art makes meaning in 3 different ways. 1, sometimes an artist makes a thing and shows it to you in such a way that you identify with it. You already see the world as they see the world, and you are in agreement. We all know this moment. Here, art acts powerfully to help confirm the reality you already comprehend by offering you that reality in the form of an image or an object that has the force of confirming that which you already know, but perhaps have been unwilling to trust or cop to or fully acknowledge. Barbara Kruger. This, for me, has been one of the largest gifts of feminist art. It helped me to articulate what I already knew to be true about the world as it exists in and through patriarchy. Feminist art is there to remind you that you are not batshit crazy. Alternately, the second way art works is that it can offer you an image or an object that describes the world as the artist sees, feels, and or inhabits. This happens with such force or clarity or distillation or bald straightforwardness that you, the viewer, apprehend the world anew and see the world as the artist has seen it. So if you ever walk through any place and you're like, oh my God, that's like a David Hammons, that just happened to you. Oh my God, that's like a Louise Lawler, that just happened to you. The artist showed you the world they see, and then you see it the way they see it. You can't unsee it. And then, because the artist has been generous enough to show you how they see the world, you see what they see everywhere. This is the gift of accrual. For as these experiences of art stack up, the viewer's world can become increasingly layered and complex. For it's as if you are moving through the world not only with your own sensory, intellectual, emotional apparatus, but you are also moving through the world with a set of borrowed or appropriated lenses as well. I think this is what some folks mean when they talk about how art is a vehicle for producing empathy. But I think that this is also one of the ways we can talk about art being central to ideas of citizenship. For to be a citizen is to be asked to navigate the world with an understanding of your sense of things as well as other people's sense of things. To be a citizen is to be equipped to make hard choices about not only what's good for you, but what's good for others, what's good for your city, what's good for increasingly abstract ideals like the public, the nation, the planet itself. It seems to me one way we do this, one way we come into an awareness of ourselves in relation to others, is through these kinds of encounters with art. Or at least I know for me, art has been my primary avenue towards such revelations and understandings about how other people see the world who are different from me, and how I now carry their vision of the world in me as I move through it. The third way I think art works to make knowledge is through its specifically nonverbal, non-linguistic, non-logical, and non-linear capacities. In this model, the artist offers a highly condensed or lapsarian vision of the world, a complex feeling about subjectivity, a discursive arena about the felt and the seen. That unbelievable Titian nude of his wife or lover right after they've had sex. There's nothing verbal in that picture, right? That kind of, the complexity of a Kerry James Marshall picture, in which as you start to unpack it, you realize how much more there is in it. No words have been laid down, and yet you're doing that work. Art presents, offers, or articulates what is sayable and what isn't. And it is in this very complicated non-linguistic space, a space worth noting here that it is virtually impossible to maintain. For our drive, the human drive towards language and making sense, is so powerful that perhaps it's even an instinct. It is in this ineffable space that the viewer sees what the artist sees, and it triggers in her another thought. This newly formed idea can be either metaphorical, something is like another thing, or metonymic, it's like a part that stands in for a whole. But in many ways, that other thought you are having is tangential to the image you are looking at. In other words, you look at a picture of one thing, and it makes you think about another thing. And in trying to negotiate the gap between those two things, you start to create a network of ideas. Basically, you start riffing off of someone else's stuff in order to figure out your own shit. I suppose I should say that for me is like, that's the trifecta. Like, if you can do all three of those things at the same time, oh my God. All right, now for an example of what this might look like. All right, I'm going to take a stab at talking about some pictures in this way. During the early 90s, I used to drink in a bar called the Chanticleer. Located on a prominent intersection on the main drag in Ithaca, New York, it had a fantastic neon sign of a rooster with a coxcomb. Because the bar was on a corner, there were actually two neon roosters on a semicircular marquee, facing each other as if in a mirror or a fight. I Googled it recently, ergo this pixelated picture, and found it on Yelp's list of the 10 best dive bars. My relief was palpable. Not only was it still there, but its status as a lounge hangout could remain solidly unchanged in my mind. There was a bar down the block from the Chanticleer, whose name I have since forgotten. This was where most of the humanities grad and MFA writing students hung out. In the days before cell phones, one could simply show up there, and invariably there would be a table of folks discussing this, that, or another text, as well as a thorough critique of whatever guest speaker had just rolled through town. At the Chanticleer, there was very little, if any, parsing of the day's readings. The Chanticleer was for serious drinking and playing pool and having encounters with real drunks, the ones farther along than we were, the ones who were from Ithaca, and the people who were going to stay in Ithaca. Not everyone from the other bar came to the Chanticleer. There was a fair amount of gumption one had to muster in order to walk through its door. This all worked for me, since at the time I wore motorcycle boots and chain-smoked cigarettes and was using bravado as a tool to negotiate just exactly who I wanted to be. One night, after God knows how many shots of wild turkey, washed down with just as many Youngling ales, I found myself wending my way to the bathroom. The wooden door had a hook-and-eye closure, and as I slipped the smooth metal hook into the perfectly positioned eye, I became entranced with the groove in the wood created by the history of this motion. The circle was worn into the door's surface as if it had been drawn with a compass, and part of its tactile satisfaction came from the fact that this indentation appeared to me then, in my sloshed state, a perfect marriage of line and texture. As my pants fell down around my knees, I found myself in a reverie about all of the people it had taken to make such a mark. And because I was in the throes of getting my PhD in art history, my inebriated self marveled at the power of the indexical, the art historical term for mark making that has a one-to-one correlation from maker to mark. Think about a handprint in the sand or a photographic negative on a piece of paper. Here, in the bathroom at the Chanticleer, was a complication. This indexical mark had been made by many rather than one. We had all played our part, each of us alone to be sure, but the sum of the whole was indeed larger than its parts. Time and again, Dyke Blair's pictures provoke this kind of memory in me. Over the years, his closely observed and oftentimes delicate gouaches of cocktails on bars, ashtrays on countertops, and cropped images of airplane windows that look out onto fields of sky blue paint have caused my knees to go a bit weak. The texture of the paper, the way the pigment grabs at the fibers, the way the water has caused them to both swell and dry, have all conspired to bring on feelings of intense covetousness. I can't tell you how often I've wondered, how difficult would it be to slip that drawing into my bag? The most recent image of Dyke Blair's that shot through the haze and activated my memory banks, bringing me back to the Chanticleer in a way I hadn't been since I left Ithaca in the mid-90s, is a straight-up oil painting of a door with 3 locks, a knob lock, a jimmy-proof deadbolt, and a security door chain. Anyone who has ever lived in New York City will immediately recognize the situation. The door speaks to a time when New York was dangerous, and apartment dwellers stack locks one on top of another as if that were the answer. The door in Blair's painting was installed before the digital world gave us Nest and security cameras to watch our pets when we aren't at home. What I love about the painting, though, is not its provocation of my analog-based childhood nostalgia, but rather the way in which the painting registers, as so many of Blair's images do, the intensity of human habit. How many times have each of us confronted the interior of a friend's locked apartment, fumbled around with how to open the door, only to step aside and mumble with a half laugh, "Why don't you do this?" And then watch your friend speedily move through all 3 locks, none of which you could figure out mere seconds before. This is the space of bodily habit, the realm of the quotidian, the jurisdiction of the banal, and yet it's the only way out of the apartment. By which I mean both literally and metaphorically, for habit is the only way we can go out into the world. Without the matrix of habit, how exactly would we even cohere into a self? The details of how one takes one's coffee, in Blair, it's almost invariably in a thick, old-fashioned pottery of a diner mug or the cheap takeout of a Dunkin' Donuts. That detail is as stabilizing as a marriage. These small moments of personal preference and bodily knowledge behave similarly to how the fascia of the body connects muscle to the bone, girding us from the ongoing effects of gravity. We step away from someone else's door because it's their door. We open our door effortlessly because it's our door. This toggling between oneself and others is, for me, the hallmark of Blair's work. Both the psychic heft and the existential truth of his pictures' loneliness, their production and registration of this most human of affects, emanates from his unsentimental depiction of how habit allows us to navigate the ongoing logic of the generic and the specific. Each scene he paints, the waiting areas of airports, bars, the too harsh incandescent light on the outdoor plants at night, the blue sky out of a plane window, the seams of a window that frame a view from the bed, leaving us just a glimpse of the treetops, the bare fluorescent bulbs on the ceiling. Each of these scenes is generic. There is nothing here we haven't seen before. Novelty is not what is at stake. Familiarity is. And yet, each image is rendered with a degree of specificity that is undeniable. That door, that hotel, that bar, that flight. In Blair's hands, life is as much about the details as it is the main event. And in Blair's world of images, there is no main event other than the detail. This is why I think his unpretentious pictures trigger such vivid memories for me. It's a bit of a bait and switch. I am seduced by the existential loneliness and generic banality of the red bucket on the studio table, of the snowy white hydrangeas against the velvety black of a country sky, just as I am equally cast back into the most particular of memories when I look at his suite of paintings of dingy ceilings and fluorescent lights. I'm lying on the shrink's couch. I'm staring at the ceiling, a play of white on white that always reminded me of a cross between Joseph Cornell and Robert Ryman. I recall how even then I knew I would remember the corner of my shrink ceiling for a long time. This is the double gift, generic and specific, of a Dyke Blair painting. First, there is the exquisite image, the ethical offering of the everyday, and the space of habit is absolutely bound up with our very possibility of being. And then there is the memory such rendering of habits induce. Memories frequently folded away, not due to trauma or displeasure, but due to an overinflated sense of our specificity. There are 2 iPhone photos of me and my aunt taken a week before she died. In both, she is laying in her bed in the infirmary at the monastery. In one, we are surrounded by other sisters and the Mother Superior. And on the wall adjacent to her bed hangs a calendar, one of those promotional ones that people send out. It's July, so the image above the calendar is a fireworks display that marks the birth of our country. Next to it hangs a reproduction of a Byzantine Madonna and Child, an image that signals the birth of Christianity, the miracle upon which her faith resided. Whenever I visited the monastery, I was acutely aware of these reproductions, which for my aunt and her sisters were not merely pictures, but active conduits for contemplation and prayer. I can't get over the effortless manner in which these images that celebrate such different beginnings are installed adjacent to my aunt's deathbed. The second image is just of me and my aunt. She has given me a present, a piece of embroidery that she started when she learned she was ill. Mind you, my aunt was no hobbyist or craftsperson. Her favorite work assignment at the monastery was those that involved the physical plant. She was way more likely to be found in a pair of Wellingtons, ready to pour concrete, than spotted laboring over needlework. But apparently she set herself this task. Could she complete the entire embroidery before she died? In the telling of this story, there was much teasing and much laughter about how antithetical this kind of work was to her very nature, and how the sisters were so impressed that they immediately took the finished embroidery to the local framer to ask him to mat and frame it. He, of course, did so for free. What was ultimately presented to me was a tondo edged in flowers with the phrase, "Love blooms eternal," in rainbow colors at the center. When I looked up to meet her gaze, she winked at me. Thank you.